They called her the wickedest woman in the world. Long before Marilyn Monroe's platinum hair and seductive smile, before Mae West's one-liners scorched the screen, and before Jean Harlow's iconic rise, there was Theda Bara, a name drenched in rumors, a face framed by heavy eye makeup, and a persona so shrouded in mystery that even her birthplace was a matter of Hollywood fabrication. She emerged during a time when the silent screen was brand new and stardom was still being invented. Audiences knew her only through the swirl of scandalous newspaper headlines and shocking publicity stills that painted her as a beguiling temptress, a master manipulator, and an otherworldly being whose sole purpose was to lure men to their doom. Yet behind the sultry gaze, the spiked eyelashes, and the lavishly draped costumes lay a woman few truly understood. Far from the sun-scorched Egyptian deserts that publicity photos loved to reference, Theda Bara was born Theodosia Goodman in Cincinnati, Ohio, a place about as far from the mystical East as one could imagine. Her father was a Polish-Jewish immigrant, her mother, Swiss. There were no sculptor fathers carving statues under the Egyptian sun, no caravans crossing the Sahara, and certainly no lineage tracing back to Cleopatra. In fact, the entire story of a veiled infant being cradled in the shadow of the pyramids was a concoction of Fox Studios, a cunning strategy to boost ticket sales in an era when Hollywood was still searching for the perfect recipe to captivate the masses. But why did audiences believe it? Because the times allowed it. Movies were new, and the thirst for novelty was insatiable. Studios discovered that audiences didn't just want entertainment. They wanted gods and goddesses descended from some exotic starry realm. They were eager to believe every rumor that further distanced these celestial screen figures from the mundane realities of everyday life. And Theda's carefully curated origin story was more than a rumor. It was a cinematic tall tale that turned her into the ultimate specimen of forbidden allure. Her roles fanned that flame even further. She wasn't just a standard leading lady. She was the vamp. She embodied a new type of on-screen seductress whose entire function was to wrap men around her little finger, use them up, and cast them aside. Audiences were both horrified and entranced. Moral guardians decried her as an affront to decency, while curious moviegoers rushed to see just how dastardly and sensuous she could be. Box office receipts soared, and Theda Bara soared right along with them, reaching a level of instant stardom that the press breathlessly labeled meteoric. Yet none of this just happened. It was engineered by savvy producers, publicists, and a press hungry for a clickable headline. Though back then, it was less click and more printed in huge letters. They drummed up stories of hidden curses, secret potions, and even posed Bara in elaborately staged photo shoots with fake snakes to hint at the serpent-like qualities of her nature. They made her into a mythic figure who straddled the line between reality and invention. It worked incredibly well, at least at first. But like any actress built up by the system, Theda eventually found herself trapped by her own image. Typecast as the eternal femme fatale, she couldn't break out to explore other types of roles. Despite her fierce popularity, she felt her creativity stifled and her personal identity submerged beneath layers of studio-constructed illusions. She was also a woman navigating the earliest days of Hollywood, a notoriously cutthroat environment even in its infancy. The big stars of the 1910s and 1920s didn't just have to worry about paparazzi snapping their pictures at unflattering angles. They had to worry about maintaining a precarious balancing act between personal freedom and studio demands. For Theda Bara, that balancing act often bordered on the impossible. Fox executives were determined to keep their money-making vamp exactly as she was. Audiences paid to see sin and seduction, and any attempt to soften her image risked damaging the brand. Still, behind the facade, Bara's life was surprisingly ordinary. She spent quiet evenings at home with her mother and sister, indulging in her love of books. She held no extravagant parties, had no salacious romantic entanglements, and played no part in the roaring Hollywood nightlife. Yet every newspaper article claimed she was a living embodiment of danger and depravity. This discrepancy between her reality and her public myth would grow into a burden. By the end of World War I, shifting cultural tastes and new, modern flapper icons like Clara Bow took center stage. The old vamp aesthetic seemed dated. Bara found herself increasingly out of step with the times, culminating in films that flopped at the box office and triggered protests from various moral or cultural groups. As her era drew to a close, tragedy would strike her legacy. Fires at the Fox Studios vaults destroyed the vast majority of her original film prints, leaving only fragments and still photographs to hint at the performances that once scandalized a nation. The result is that Theda Bara exists today more as an image than a reality, a shadowy phantom from silent cinema's earliest days. Yet that very fact, the scarcity of her surviving works, continues to fuel fascination. How can someone so pivotal in Hollywood's formation, whose name was once on par with Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin, become reduced to a mere footnote in cinematic history? Why has her image on a chaise lounge surrounded by veils endured, while her actual voice and performances are largely lost to time? To explore these questions, one has to dig beneath the glittering facade of invented biography, sensational headlines, and carefully posed photos. One has to follow the winding path from her humble beginnings in Cincinnati to the press conferences in Oriental-themed hotel rooms, from her triumphant run as Cleopatra to the quiet years spent away from the camera. In these layers of myth, scandal, and heartbreak lies the story of how Hollywood's first true sex symbol was born, worshipped, and eventually cast aside when the next trend arrived. This script peels back each layer of that story, moving through the illusions step by step until we reach the real Theodosia Goodman, an individual who dreamed of being a serious actress, but was swept up into a maelstrom of cinematic trickery that both made her a legend and cost her everything. In the end, Theda Bara is more than a historical curiosity. She's a symbol of Hollywood's power to shape narratives, to transform ordinary people into demigods on the silver screen. She also exemplifies how quickly that same machinery can discard you once the box office stops ringing. But that's only the beginning of her remarkable odyssey. Let's step into the swirling desert sands of Theda's invented Egypt, into the world of serpents, curses, and illusions, and see how she rose to fame as the vamp who seduced an entire generation. Hollywood has always been a dream factory, and in the 1910s, the factory was running on pure invention. Directors and producers were still figuring out how best to market films to a population that was just discovering the thrill of moving pictures. It didn't take long for them to realize that a good backstory could be as vital as a good performance. So when Theodosia Goodman, an unassuming young woman from Cincinnati, walked into their offices with her large, expressive eyes and understated charm, they saw an opportunity. She had been born around 1885 to a family of modest means. Her father, Bernard Goodman, was a Polish-born Jew who made a living in Cincinnati, and her mother, Pauline, was a homemaker with Swiss roots. Theodosia's upbringing was culturally ordinary for the time, but the studios wanted something more theatrical. They wanted a woman with an aura of the exotic, someone who could capture the public's imagination by merely walking into a room. So they wove an elaborate tapestry of lies around her birth. Instead of Ohio, they set her cradle in the scorching sands of Egypt, where the shadow of the Sphinx loomed over her tent. They reinvented her father as an Italian sculptor and her mother as a French actress. They sprinkled in stories of caravans, ancient tombs, and mystic powers. That might sound absurd now, but early 20th century audiences were far easier to convince. Newspapers weren't as rigorously fact-checked, and the average person had no real way of verifying the claims that studios put forward. Journalists, eager for a sensational scoop, often took these narratives at face value. Articles would breathlessly describe Theda's supposed childhood in the desert, her aristocratic lineage, and her rumored knowledge of arcane spells. Some even speculated she might be part gypsy, part princess, or part sorceress. The concept of a vampire had only recently entered popular culture via Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, and Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Vampire. But in the cinematic lexicon of 1915, the vamp was a woman who vampirically fed off the souls of men, a femme fatale in the purest sense. These extravagant fables served a double purpose. They set Theda Bara apart from the wave of wholesome girl-next-door actresses who were also vying for the spotlight, and they drew in audiences who wanted to be both thrilled and frightened by her presence. It was the perfect strategy for a brand-new medium desperately looking to distinguish itself from stage theater. On stage, you could see the actors live and often knew their background. On screen, they could be anything, anyone, from anywhere. The magic of film allowed illusions to become reality, and Theda's illusions were among the most potent of them all. While the general public ate this up, Theodosia herself quietly navigated the contradictions. In her private life, she was known to friends as a smart, curious woman with an aptitude for pranks. She had grown up a bookworm, devouring everything from classical literature to modern novels, and she developed a keen sense of humor. Yet whenever she stepped into the spotlight to promote her new motion pictures, she had to don the persona of a mysterious foreign siren. She would speak in a carefully practiced accent, slip into exotic costumes, and answer reporters' questions with cryptic hints about potions, curses, or her life in the desert. It was both exhilarating and exhausting. Even her new name, Theda Bara, was a creation carefully crafted to sound exotic. Some publicists claimed it was an anagram for Arab death, further adding to the mystique. Others said it was derived from her real name, Theodosia shortened to Theda, and Bara from part of her maternal grandfather's name. No one in the publicity machine cared about verifying the true origin of the name. They only cared that it rolled off the tongue like a dark incantation and made an impression on the audience. This disconnect between Theda's real life and her Hollywood persona would become a key theme in her career. Decades later, historians and film buffs have tried to piece together her genuine biography, but the early fabrications still linger, making it difficult to separate fact from fiction. Although she was, in truth, more of a homebody who preferred reading or knitting to any form of scandalous behavior, the public still saw her as a woman who might slip venom in a man's drink and watch him writhe with a sadistic smile. From the vantage point of our modern media environment, it might seem ludicrous that entire swaths of the public believed these tall tales. But remember, in the 1910s, globalization was minimal compared to today. Most people had never traveled overseas, and even fewer had set foot in the Middle East. If a studio executive said this woman was of Egyptian royalty, well, who could prove otherwise? Journalists might ask some pointed questions, but in the end, they also wanted to sell newspapers and magazines. A story about a desert-born enchantress with a questionable lineage was far more compelling than the mundane facts of a Midwestern childhood. These press-driven illusions laid the groundwork for Theda Bara's cinematic success. They ensured that by the time she appeared in her breakout film, audiences had already been primed to see her as an otherworldly menace. It's no surprise, then, that when she finally got the role that would define her career, people flocked to the theaters, hoping to glimpse the rumored dark magic for themselves. Yet, like any great illusion, it had an expiration date. The truth would eventually seep out, especially as Theda became more famous and reporters dug deeper. But that didn't stop Fox from milking every inch of exotic detail for as long as they could. At press events, they draped rooms with incense-filled corners, Persian rugs, and large drapes to hint at hidden entrances. Theda would recline on plush cushions, wearing flowing robes, meeting the gazes of reporters with an aloof poise that suggested centuries of ancient knowledge. Then, after the reporters departed, she'd shake off the accent, laugh about the performance, and go back to being an ordinary American woman with a knack for witty banter. But that was only part of the story. Because while the mystique set the stage, it was her first major role that truly cemented Theda Bara as the era's reigning seductress. If the invented origin story lit the fire of public intrigue, then a fool. There was poured fuel on it until it exploded into a nationwide phenomenon. Released in 1915, this film wasn't just a success, it was a cultural event. Adapted from a play inspired by Rudyard Kipling's poem, The Vampire, the movie introduced mainstream audiences to the concept of a vamp. No fangs, no coffins, but a predatory woman who ensnares men through irresistible seduction. Theda's character was simply known as the Vampire. She didn't even need a proper name. The entire narrative revolved around the devastation she wrought on a married man. With her dark eyes, intense close-ups, and slow, deliberate gestures, she mesmerized viewers. The notion that a woman could be so openly evil, so brazenly manipulative, was startling in 1915. This was decades before the femme fatale archetype became common in film noir. Theda's vamp was a fresh and shocking departure from the more innocent heroines of the day. The film's tagline, "Kiss me, my fool," even became a catchphrase that tapped into the anxieties and fantasies of an American public just edging into the modern age. On posters, Theda was depicted gazing directly at the viewer, an unnerving yet alluring invitation to step into her world of moral decay. Critics were divided. Some thought the movie was scandalous garbage, little more than immoral trash trying to lure young girls into sinful ways. Others praised its sheer boldness, calling it a pioneering step in exploring the darker side of human relationships on screen. But moral condemnation only made people more curious. Lines around the block formed in major cities, and smaller towns soon found themselves in heated debates over whether the local theater should be allowed to show such indecent content. That, of course, translated into massive profits for Fox. Suddenly, Theda Bara was famous. Virtually overnight, she became a symbol of forbidden attraction. Those who disapproved still flocked to see her, if only to confirm their worst suspicions. Those who loved it savored every minute of her sinister performance. Hollywood quickly realized it had found a goldmine. Theda's vamp persona could be replicated in a dozen different settings, from biblical epics to modern-day morality tales. And so the offers poured in. Even as she took on new roles, the concept remained the same. Bara would play a woman whose mere presence spelled disaster for any man unfortunate enough to cross her path. Films like Sin, Destruction, and The Serpent followed a similar pattern: seduce, destroy, move on. Audiences, for a time, couldn't get enough. Yet behind the camera, Theda was grappling with the gap between her real self and her on-screen identity. She was a relatively shy individual who found the swirling rumor mill both amusing and daunting. During one of her earliest photo shoots for A Fool There Was, she was required to wear a bathing suit, a scandalous costume for 1915. A large crowd of curious onlookers gathered to watch, and Theda reportedly felt so embarrassed that she considered quitting right there. Her private diaries, sparse as they are, hint at her discomfort with being paraded as a kind of public spectacle. But the film's success changed everything. She now had a stage name recognized across the country, a salary far beyond what she had earned in her struggling theater days, and a fan base that demanded more wickedness. The studios were delighted to deliver. They gave interviews in which Theda Bara was described as a living embodiment of the vampire archetype. They claimed she had the most wicked face of any woman, that her eyes resembled serpent slits, and her mouth was like the scheming smile of Delilah. In reality, she was nothing of the sort. Former colleagues described her as courteous, gentle, and intelligent, far from the bloodthirsty image splashed across magazine covers. But these details never made it into the official press releases. They didn't fit the brand. The concept of an actor becoming so entwined with a single character was new territory in 1915. Early film stars weren't generally recognized by name. In fact, many silent films didn't even credit their actors. The studios feared that if stars became too famous, they'd demand higher wages. But Theda arrived at a tipping point. Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin had already begun to break that mold, and audiences were starting to follow specific performers, not just the stories. Theda represented a new dimension to that star system. The idea that an actor's off-screen life should match their on-screen persona, or at least appear to. If she was a vamp on screen, she had to be a vamp for the press as well. It's telling that whenever reporters interviewed her in this period, they did so in an elaborately decorated hotel suite that looked like a cross between an Egyptian temple and a Parisian boudoir. Thick curtains, incense burners shaped like ancient idols, maybe a few snakes. Fox made sure the environment screamed forbidden mystique. Theda would recline in exotic silks, speak with a subdued, foreign-sounding accent, and answer questions in riddles. Then, after the reporters departed, she'd shake off the accent, laugh about the performance, and go back to being an ordinary American woman with a knack for witty banter. The synergy between her true self and the fabricated version was precarious, but it worked, at least during those first few years. Unfortunately, success in Hollywood is rarely indefinite. For Theda Bara, the downfall began not because of any scandal she perpetrated, but because of the inherent limitations of the vamp role and the shifting cultural tides. But before the downfall came the apex of her career. A pinnacle reached when she donned the crown of Egypt's most legendary queen and walked onto the set of one of the silent era's most lavish productions. From her earliest appearances, Theda Bara's off-screen persona was every bit as calculated as her cinematic performances. Fox Studios spared no expense in crafting the illusions that would keep the public enthralled. Behind the scenes, studio executives recognized the box office gold in Theda's wicked woman image and ran with it. They commissioned carefully staged photographs, some of which showed her writhing on the floor with snakes or peering malevolently at the camera with heavy eye makeup. In others, she lounged seductively among velvet draperies, an air of pagan ritual suggested by the dramatic lighting and eerie props. None of it was spontaneous. Every pose, every costume, every rumor of otherworldly rites performed behind closed doors was orchestrated by a small army of publicists. Articles would appear hinting that Theda had an actual python as a beloved pet, or that she kept a private menagerie of exotic creatures in her dressing room. In truth, she was uncomfortable around snakes and had no such menagerie. That didn't matter. The public wanted a good story, and the studio provided one. One especially infamous publicity stunt involved a phrenologist, a practitioner of the debunked pseudoscience of reading personality traits from skull shapes, announcing that Theda's head measurements indicated she had a reptilian muscular system. Absurd as it sounds today, the news caused a minor sensation, fueling the image of a woman who was part serpent. Whether audiences believed it or not, it aligned perfectly with the snake imagery so often associated with her. Fox reveled in these sensational tidbits, knowing they'd keep Theda in the headlines and the vamp persona alive. Meanwhile, Theda found herself walking a tightrope. On one hand, these stunts boosted her fame and financial security. On the other, they locked her into a narrow pigeonhole. Every time she appeared in a press conference, she had to maintain the accent and the otherworldly demeanor. The simplest slip, a laugh at the wrong moment, or a revelation that she'd spent her childhood in Ohio, risked unraveling the carefully woven tapestry. Despite her private misgivings, Theda was aware that this was the path to success. Rejecting the vamp persona outright would mean turning her back on the very platform that had launched her from obscurity to household name. In some ways, this was the blueprint for modern celebrity culture. Contemporary stars often craft an image. Think about pop icons known for their outrageous costumes or reclusive, mysterious lifestyles, and feed the public with carefully curated content. Yet in the 1910s, Theda's brand of exotic mysticism was far more extreme, because audiences were not yet jaded by behind-the-scenes documentaries or social media reveals. They had no immediate means of fact-checking, so the illusions soared unfettered. Moreover, the dynamic between studio control and actor agency was starkly different back then. Fox could, quite literally, dictate Theda's daily schedule, costume choices, and even her living arrangements if they so desired. The star system was evolving, but it hadn't yet given full autonomy to its biggest names. When Theda felt stifled by the monotony of playing the same character type over and over, she discovered she had little say in the matter. The studio had invested heavily in her vamp identity, and each new film was essentially a repackaging of that central theme. An anecdote often told among film historians involves Theda Bara's attempt to appear on screen as a more traditional heroine. Fox allowed it, but only if she agreed to do it in a film they barely promoted. Unsurprisingly, the film bombed. The press hardly covered it, and the public, so used to seeing her as the malevolent seductress, was confused by the promotional stills showing her in normal attire. Rather than risk further confusion, Fox jammed her right back into the vamp roles, marketing each one with ever more flamboyant claims. She soon realized that for all her star power, she was mostly a marionette dancing to the studio's tune. Still, it would be a mistake to paint Theda Bara as a passive victim. She was nobody's fool. She knew how to leverage her star status to negotiate better contracts and pay raises. There are stories of her refusing certain scripts until the money was sufficient, or until certain promotional demands were met. She understood the business side of film production enough to realize that her value depended on perpetuating the exotic fantasy. Privately, she might yearn for a more diverse range of roles, but publicly, she leaned into what sold tickets. Fox, meanwhile, was in stiff competition with other studios eager to manufacture their own exotic temptresses. But none matched the hype generated by Theda Bara. She was the first, the most sensational, and by many accounts, the best at embodying a lethal combination of glamour and cruelty. Her eyes, heavily outlined in kohl, became a signature image, one that would define the vamp archetype for years to come. By the time Cleopatra came around in 1917, Theda was at the height of her powers. The lavish production was promoted as a spectacle of sin and decadence. Rumors circulated that her costumes were so revealing that censors were left gasping for air, and that one slip of fabric would have the entire studio shut down by outraged decency boards. The media devoured every snippet of scandalous detail they could find. Tens of thousands of fans lined up to see if Cleopatra would indeed be the wickedest woman in history, as the posters promised. And Theda Bara, weighed down by layers of ornate jewelry and massive headpieces, delivered a performance so mesmerizing that critics couldn't decide whether to applaud or condemn. Yet the seeds of her downfall were already sprouting. Moral outcry threatened to curtail her more overtly risque portrayals. World War I was coming to an end, and a new era with different cultural mores was looming on the horizon. The jazz-age flapper, carefree and modern, was replacing the dark-lipped vamp as the emblem of female rebellion. Hollywood was shifting too. Bigger budgets, more competition, and an audience hungry for fresh faces and new genres. The vamp formula, once so shocking, was at risk of becoming stale. Studio control, so effective at one point, now threatened to box Theda into a corner. Fox was reluctant to adapt her image to the evolving times. They wanted Cleopatra after Cleopatra, biblical seductress after biblical seductress, and a never-ending parade of serpentine photo shoots. It worked until it didn't. By refusing to let her branch out, they inadvertently turned her into a relic of a bygone moment in cinematic style. Nevertheless, Theda marched on, at least for a while. She took each role with professionalism, delivered the over-the-top dramatic expressions silent cinema demanded, and participated in the bizarre press junkets that made headlines. Yet she couldn't stop what was happening outside the studio gates. A real sea change in public tastes, accelerated by world events. As soon as the war ended, people wanted to laugh, dance, and embrace modern fashions. The heavy, doom-laden vamp aesthetic was fast losing its appeal. Before she realized it, Theda Bara's unstoppable hype machine was careening toward a cliff. In the world of silent cinema, 1917 was a year of extremes for Theda Bara. On one hand, she was catapulted to new heights thanks to the massive success of Cleopatra, a film that took the scandalous notes of her earlier work and amplified them to epic proportions. Critics, moral guardians, and fans alike couldn't stop talking about her. Some referred to her Cleopatra as Satan in female form, while others praised her magnetic screen presence. The controversies only fueled ticket sales. For a moment, Theda appeared unstoppable. She was making an unprecedented salary for a female star, often likened to the earnings of Mary Pickford, known as America's sweetheart. A remarkable achievement for someone labeled America's most wicked import. But just as she approached the zenith of her career, the wheels began to wobble. Part of this had to do with the unpredictable nature of silent-era censorship. At the time, there was no single unified film board. Different states and cities enforced their own guidelines, some stricter than others. A film widely shown in California might be banned or heavily edited in Ohio or Pennsylvania. This patchwork system created a logistical nightmare for studios, and sometimes led to bizarre remedies, like adding epilogues in certain regions that revealed the events of the movie had all been a dream, thus making the immoral actions more palatable to conservative viewers. Theda's films, drenched in seduction and betrayal, were prime targets for these censors. Although she was Fox's golden goose, the studios had to weigh the risk of alienating entire markets. By 1918, The cost of sustaining the vamp persona in the face of increasing moral pushback began to take its toll. It didn't help that her outlandish characters often overshadowed the narratives themselves, making them easy targets for criticism that they were all shock, no substance. Another factor was the seismic shift in global culture. World War I ravaged Europe, and when it ended in November 1918, people were hungry for new forms of entertainment. Light-hearted comedies, uplifting dramas, and romances that spoke to hope rather than despair. The heavy gloom of the vamp, once thrillingly taboo, now felt out of sync with the times. Younger stars like Clara Bow and Louise Brooks were emerging, embodying a brand new style, the flapper. Flappers were modern, energetic, and a bit rebellious, but in a way that felt playful rather than ominous. Their short bobbed hair, loose dresses, and carefree attitudes captivated a post-war generation ready to shed darkness. Theda Bara, for all her box office success, was firmly associated with sin and darkness. Suddenly, that trademark glare and swirling chiffon didn't seem quite as revolutionary. People had seen it before, year after year. They craved something fresh, and flappers looked like the future. Indeed, the entire entertainment industry was pivoting toward these new icons, leaving behind the Victorian and Edwardian moral hang-ups that had once made Theda's screen persona so scandalously delightful. Amid these changes, Theda tried to reinvent herself. She openly demanded better scripts from Fox, ones that would allow her to showcase a softer or more dynamic range. She wanted to play heroines, comedic leads, anything other than the vamp. The studio balked, worried that her legions of fans would reject a nice Theda Bara. Negotiations for new contracts became tense. While she was still a star, her bargaining power wasn't limitless. The brand was too entrenched, and Fox was too reluctant to gamble with their golden ticket. During this period, Theda also began to rebel in subtle ways. She would arrive on set later than scheduled, citing the stress of the repetitive roles. She displayed a new confidence in turning down certain costume choices that she felt were too ridiculous or revealing. This was her attempt at exercising some autonomy, but it further strained her relationship with the studio. Executives interpreted it as diva behavior, or worse, a sign that their prized vamp was growing unmanageable. Her frustration peaked in 1919, when she announced a strike of sorts. She wouldn't take on any new vamp roles until she was offered a decent, good girl script. Fox begrudgingly relented and offered her Kathleen Mavourneen, a story about an Irish girl, a stark departure from Cleopatra, or the biblical temptresses she'd portrayed. Theda was overjoyed at the chance to show her range. She saw it as the lifeline she'd been waiting for, the project that would prove she could captivate audiences without serpent costumes or lethal innuendo. Tragically, Kathleen Mavourneen proved to be a disaster of epic proportions. Irish-American groups protested what they saw as a demeaning portrayal of their culture. They also took issue with the casting of a Jewish actress in the lead role, at a time when anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiments simmered in certain segments of American society. Screenings were met with outrage, sometimes even riots, and Fox quickly pulled the film from circulation to avoid negative publicity. This fiasco effectively destroyed Theda's hopes of reinventing herself. Her star, once bright enough to overshadow nearly all negative press, now flickered. Without a major success to keep her in the public's good graces, she was left exposed to both critical and commercial disappointment. At 35, she was already considered old by Hollywood standards of the day, especially for a female star known for seduction. Sensing the tide turning, she parted ways with Fox. Yet leaving the studio that had so carefully built her myth came at a cost. She was a free agent, but in a world rapidly forgetting her iconic brand of allure. It was the early 1920s, a decade that belonged to the Charleston dance, cocktail parties, and short skirts. The vamp began to look like a relic from another era, a creature from the war-torn 1910s who no longer fit the exuberant mood of the roaring 20s. The novelty that had propelled Bara to stardom was no longer novel. Desperate to resurrect her career, she tried Broadway. In The Blue Flame, she attempted to harness her fame as a star attraction, but audiences greeted her with laughter instead of awe. Critics panned her performance as dated and hammy, not in tune with the modern stage. She made some money off the show, thanks to a savvy profit-sharing contract, but her theatrical ambitions didn't fare well in the court of public opinion. After marrying director Charles Brabham, she bowed out of the film industry almost entirely, with a brief, unsuccessful comeback attempt in 1925's The Unchastened Woman. As the 1920s roared on, silent films themselves faced an existential threat from emerging sound technology. By the time talkies arrived in the late 1920s, Theda Bara's brand of silent menace was all but extinct. She had stepped away from the madness voluntarily, but it left her a footnote in cinematic history, at least for a while. The final blow to her legacy, however, would be delivered not by critics or changing tastes, but by literal flames. During this time, storms and rumors continued to swirl. Some speculated that she was deeply embittered by her typecasting, while others insisted she secretly delighted in being the ultimate femme fatale. There were whispers about her being difficult to work with, uncooperative on set, or ungrateful for the fame Fox had handed her. None of these claims were definitively proven. If anything, her co-stars often spoke warmly of her kindness and humility. But sensational stories about behind-the-scenes drama always generate more buzz than mundane truths. In the end, the storms that dogged Theda's career did not revolve around substance abuse or personal scandals, unlike certain other silent-era luminaries who faced damning accusations. Instead, it was her very image that stirred the pot. The uproars, riots over perceived cultural misrepresentations, moral watchdogs howling about her outfits, were all part of the swirling vortex that thrust her into the limelight in the first place. Without them, perhaps she would never have become a star at all of which might have made her a mere footnote in silent film history, had fate not decreed an even crueler blow. Because in 1937, an event occurred that would turn her once glorious cinematic achievements into a tragic cautionary tale about film preservation. The year was 1937, and the Fox Studios vault in Little Ferry, New Jersey, erupted in flames. For silent film historians, it's one of the great calamities in cinematic history. Highly flammable nitrate film stock combined with poor storage conditions meant that once a spark was lit, entire catalogs could vanish in a matter of minutes. The flames consumed reels upon reels of silent-era classics, including the majority of Theda Bara's films. In a cruel twist of irony, the studio that had so meticulously crafted her myth was now helpless to save the physical evidence of her stardom. When the ashes settled, it became clear that the majority of Theda's major works, including the iconic Cleopatra, were lost forever. A second fire in a New York storage facility finished off what little might have remained. What survived were scattered fragments, a few short reels, and a handful of other features that miraculously escaped the blaze. Film historians, decades later, would lament that so few recordings of the vamp's performances existed, forcing them to rely on studio stills and archived publicity materials to reconstruct what her on-screen presence might have felt like. The heartbreak here lies in the fact that Theda Bara was a defining star of her generation. Yet modern audiences have almost no way to experience the nuances of her performances. While Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin benefit from the survival of key films that illustrate their genius, Bara's historical place rests largely on second-hand accounts. Magazine articles, posters, and press clippings offer glimpses of the fervor she once generated, but the essence of her acting is now limited to a tiny smattering of surviving reels. In the 1930s, few saw film archiving as a priority. Silent movies were considered obsolete once talkies took over, leading many studios to discard or recycle old reels. The concept of preserving them for posterity was far from mainstream. When the fires burned, they incinerated not just a body of work, but also the chance for future generations to judge Theda Bara for themselves, unfiltered by the sensationalist press. All that remained were the myths, the stories, the illusions, making her more ghost than person. This near-total destruction had a perverse side effect. It kept Theda Bara in the realm of legend. For a time, she was largely forgotten, overshadowed by stars whose films survived the era of transition to sound. Yet whenever her name surfaced, it came wrapped in the same aura of sin, scandal, and lost mystique. Some fans, upon discovering a stray Theda Bara film poster at an antiques store, were astonished by the bold artwork and wondered who this mesmerizing woman was. Film enthusiasts passing around the few extant clips treated them like holy relics of a vanished civilization. By the 1950s, interest in silent cinema began to reawaken, spurred by nostalgia and the emergence of academic film study programs. Scholars digging through archives noted a glaring absence. Where was Cleopatra, one of the biggest box office hits of 1917? Where were the reels from A Fool There Was, or The Serpent in their original uncut form? The deeper they dug, the more heartbreaking the truth became. The name Theda Bara turned up again and again in references to lost or partially lost films. She stood at the top of the most wanted lists for archivists hoping to uncover hidden film canisters in forgotten basements or foreign storage facilities. Her husband, Charles Brabham, had tried to preserve some keepsakes of her career, but the scope of the destruction was simply too vast. The few surviving items, stills, scripts, some publicity notes, told only part of the story. Meanwhile, comedic references to Theda Bara found their way into pop culture, as if mocking the bygone craze. One famous instance occurred in an episode of I Love Lucy, where Lucy Ricardo boasts of seeing Cleopatra multiple times, and her friend Ethel responds with a sarcastic barb that lumps Theda Bara with other outdated fads. For Theda herself, none of this was part of any plan. She had already stepped away from the spotlight long before the fires. The extent of the loss probably only fully hit her in retrospect, when she realized that her cinematic legacy was literally going up in smoke. But if it pained her, she never made a public spectacle of it. She might have expressed private regrets to friends or to Brabham, but by then she was living a relatively subdued existence, far from the extravagances of her screen persona. This destruction of her films is one of the greatest cultural losses from early Hollywood. It robbed Theda of the chance to be re-evaluated by later audiences who might have found new layers in her performances, or recognized her as a pioneering female figure in a male-dominated industry. Although we have enough documentary evidence to confirm her historical significance, the visceral experience of watching her Cleopatra prowl through ornate sets, or her serpentine vamp lure a man to his doom, is forever lost. In recent decades, there have been efforts to restore and digitize any discovered fragments of her work. Occasionally, a random reel surfaces in a private collection or an overseas archive, igniting hope that more of Bara's oeuvre might survive than previously believed. These discoveries typically spark short-lived excitement in the classic film community, accompanied by articles in film journals that analyze every minute detail of her performance. But such finds are rare, and the majority of her major roles remain missing. Thus, the vamp lingers in cultural memory as a phantom, a creature of rumor, sensational press accounts, and a few ephemeral frames flickering in half-preserved reels. Anyone wanting to truly understand her star power and the exact qualities that made audiences swoon or faint with outrage has to rely on the recollections and gossip of an era more than a century past. Curiously, this has also fueled modern-day fascination. People love a mystery, and Theda Bara's near-invisible filmography makes her the perfect figure to mythologize. Even decades after her passing in 1955, Theda Bara remains an enigmatic figure who symbolizes both the magic and the impermanence of early Hollywood. Her legacy is simultaneously monumental and fragile. She was, by all measures, one of the first true movie stars, a pioneer who demonstrated how a single persona could attract nationwide attention and box office success. She showcased the raw potential of cinema to explore darker, more forbidden aspects of human desire, setting a precedent that would echo throughout the film noir era and beyond. Yet the same industry that birthed her legend also consumed it. Her meticulously crafted image as an Egyptian-born seductress was a marketing ploy, one that eventually trapped her in a narrow range of roles. When culture moved on, the studios did too, leaving Theda Bara stranded as a relic of a previous moment in film history. The fires that destroyed her work stand as a grim reminder of how easily cinematic legacies can be erased. Today, she dwells largely in the realm of half-remembrance, present in the scattered references of film connoisseurs, in the occasional coffee table book on silent cinema, and in the handful of surviving still photographs that capture her intense gaze and dramatic costumes. And yet, that too can be seen as a curious form of immortality. She is sometimes remembered more for what we cannot watch than for what we can. The fragments left behind, posters, postcards, the stirring titles of her lost films, continue to be studied and revered. Modern fans scour eBay and specialized collector shops for any piece of Theda Bara memorabilia they can find. Online forums buzz with speculation about any rumored discovery of a mislabeled canister that might contain a print of Cleopatra. To some degree, this makes Theda Bara a permanent mystery, an unsolved puzzle that invites each new generation of cinephiles to peer back into the silent era and imagine what she must have been like. It allows for endless reinterpretations, from feminist readings that celebrate her portrayal of female power to moralistic critiques that label her as a destructive archetype of womanhood. The truth, as always, is likely more nuanced. She was both a product of her time and a mold breaker within it. She was a marketing creation and a genuine talent who thrived in the language of silent film. She was a mild-mannered individual in everyday life, yet on screen she burned with reckless intensity. Her story also serves as a cautionary tale about the illusions that define stardom. Like many who followed, Rita Hayworth, Marilyn Monroe, and other icons who became trapped by their own personas, Theda found that the same image that propelled her to fame also prevented her from evolving beyond it. She reminds us that fame in Hollywood can be as fleeting as it is intoxicating, and that the line between marketing myth and personal identity can become perilously thin. In modern pop culture, references to Theda Bara often come wrapped in humor or irony, as if we can't quite believe that 1910s America bought into the idea of an Arab death vamp. But perhaps we're underestimating the allure of that era's cinematic illusions. People wanted an escape from their daily routines, a glimpse of dark fantasy, a safe brush with danger. She delivered it in spades, shaping the template for every screen siren who followed. In a sense, Theda Bara's illusions were never truly debunked. They simply became an integral part of film lore. Ultimately, what remains is the central paradox. Theda Bara was at once the most visible star of her age and the least visible to our modern eyes. We know her name. We see her face in black and white stills. We hear rumors of her Cleopatra being so scandalous that entire towns banned it. But we cannot sit down and watch that film. Nor can we fully fathom the power of her performance in A Fool There Was from the surviving scraps. This combination of presence and absence lends an aura of timelessness. She remains perpetually out of reach, fueling a fascination that might not exist had her filmography survived intact. In that way, Theda Bara exemplifies the ephemeral nature of early Hollywood. She was born Theodosia Goodman of Cincinnati, was transformed into the vamp by a strategic studio machine, and then drifted away as new fads took center stage. Yet here we are, still talking about her, still intrigued by those charcoal-rimmed eyes and the tales of unsuspecting men destroyed by her smoldering allure. Her final statement on the ephemeral nature of fame might well be summed up by a line often attributed to her. "To be good is to be forgotten. I'm going to be bad." In being bad, she ensured she'd remain etched in the annals of cinematic history as Hollywood's first true sex symbol. Perhaps overshadowed at times, but never fully lost. She remains an essential chapter in the grand story of film, a ghostly presence reminding us that sometimes the illusions of Hollywood are more lasting than the tangible reels they were printed on. And that, in itself, may be the greatest secret of Theda Bara's enduring mystique.